Right. So today we're going to look at something we haven't, we've kind of tiptoed around so far to this point. Um, and that's really going to be styling things in React. We haven't really yet, at least, touched on sort of how we can, make our code look nice, to be honest. Right until now, I've used mostly the create React app styles, right, that it creates for you. And there's few CSS files. We've seen those already. Right, we know that we can use CSS to style React. If we want, we know we can use the class name property for our components, and then use that similar to how we'd use CSS classes. So that's one way we can do it, which is fine and works. It can get a little tedious, obviously, and means we're writing in two different languages, which can be fine, but can also be a little less than ideal, depending on what you're trying to do. So here we have this basic app for today, right? We're going to try to get away from that and do a little of our own sort of stylistic coding. To start out with, we're going to just have this heading and this table that I just took really briefly from the docs of one of the libraries we'll look at as well, just to get some fake data into a table. So if we look at my app, it's pretty simple, right? We have this h3 and then this table. All right, this table obviously has some styles declared in line, right? We can use the style prop. We can pass it a JavaScript object, right? Again, these first two curly braces are for, this is a JavaScript expression. The inner value we give it is just an object, right? An object with a key margin, which corresponds to some, CSS property, and then a value, right, which corresponds to the value we want to customize the property to. Here it's just margin auto, just so that my table, right, will move over into the middle of the page the way I'm looking at it. So this is one slightly easier way we can work with styles, and I say easier simply because this is JavaScript, so we don't need to go from one language to another with our styles. If we want, right, to make this a little more readable, obviously doing all of these styles in line with a ton of attribute value pairs is going to take a lot of effort. So if we want to, we can move this up and out of our component and just create a style object. I'll just call it, for now, styles. Right, and we'll leave this here to start out with. Right, we have margin auto. Obviously, I got rid of a style that we were giving the table, so it has uncentered itself, and now it exists on the left side of our page. This is nice, right? This can help a little bit, but the real utility with creating a style object like this is that if we want to, we can make our styles a little more specific, right? So for example, I can create this new key, this new property, center table, and I can effectively use properties in here like class names, right, to access specific styles from just one specific, large object. I can get center table, for example. So if I want to in here, I can then reference just styles dot center table and get rid of these inner curly braces because I no longer need the second object, right? And so this, again, this just corresponds to these styles, and then I can use them again. We can keep adding to this, right? We can add different styles for different elements or parts of our UI as we want, which may honestly, help us in the long run, right? We can, again, keep all our styles in one place, but also keep them in JavaScript, the language that we're already writing the rest of our code in. We can kind of cut out the need for CSS and its own external CSS file. So for example, I can create this other right, this other property heading text, and then create additional styles for, right, our heading component right here, right? So I can just say for now, I don't know, background color. We'll just make it blue. All right, and then I can simply, again, just use the same object, but pass this heading element our new styles. So I can give it style equals prop, styles dot heading text. And then when I save my app, right, when the development server refreshes, we see that we're using, right, gaining our styles from the same object. This is one small example of what in React is sometimes called CSS in JS, or again, just the ability to do all of your styling through JavaScript, right? Here we have an object. Instead of having to use additional languages, go outside of JavaScript for functionality, we can keep as much of our development down to one language as possible, which can help us pretty greatly and make our code a little easier to use. To take this sort of to its logical conclusion, right? I can take from app, I can take maybe this app header right here, then essentially try to convert this, right? If I change the casing so it looks like JavaScript, try to convert all of this into actual usable JavaScript from what was CSS before, right? We have to get rid of the hyphens too. But as we slowly go, we should be able to end up, right, from where we were with just CSS with an actual, fully JavaScript styling. Which again, from the perspective of being a JavaScript developer, working entirely in JavaScript, makes our lives a little easier. We can import, we can export our styles, we can put them in their own file, right? We can modularize them, we can organize them in whatever complicated way we want with different properties and values if we so desire. And again, it just keeps us somewhere a little friendlier than working in CSS and JS next to each other. So let's see, there we go. These may not all work perfectly. Many of them should, but we don't have a flex container. On the page right now, I guess we could do it with this, but this is just a quick example. We're not going to actually use, again, some of these values syntactically might be a little off at this point. So I'm not going to use it, but it's just an idea, right? We can create essentially what's a class, but in JavaScript with all of its specific styles. If we wanted to spend some time and really get these elements nice and perfectly styled. We obviously won't always have the ability to style things perfectly, though, from start to finish exactly how we want. There are libraries to help us with that. There are many pre-made components out there. There are many big pre-made component libraries out there as well. A few examples of that we can use is React Bootstrap, which I have up over here for our table. React Bootstrap is really React components that are adapted from the Bootstrap framework created by Twitter, which is a CSS framework. It's pretty popular amongst design and styling, even in just raw CSS, but they made their own React component library as well, which is nice. Again, they have huge docs, right? You can install the library if you want, and you get access to all these different components that you can then either have pre-styled out of the box, or if you want, you have some level of customization as well. One alternative is Material UI, which was created by Google, and is a similar sort of, both component functionality and styling related library that we can use to, again, install a ton of components. Material UI is massive, so to install it, you actually only install part of the library, and there's a ton of additional, more niche components you probably don't need. To start out with, that you can get with subsequent installs if you want something more specific. Using these is mostly as simple as finding the component you want in their docs and then looking at how they recommend you use it, right? And looking at what the properties they have might be to customize it. As a quick example, I've already imported, right? I've already installed Material UI and React Bootstrap, so they show up already in my package.json, right? We'll see React Bootstrap right here. Material UI right here. So I have access to many of their built-in components already. I've imported 3 of them, so a button, text fields, and from Material UI, and then table from React Bootstrap. So we'll start with the table real quick. So I'll just, for now, just capitalize this T in table here and here, and then get rid of our old style. We don't need these props anymore. This is going to come pre-styled, and just add a few props from their documentation for now. So striped, bordered, and hover, which will just tell us again we want it bordered, right? We want borders to show up. Hover is what they use to add a little hover functionality over each row, so you get a little bit of nice visual feedback. And then striped, which just gives us alternating rows with different colors. Again, if you look at the docs, you'll usually see eventually what basic properties you need. This is largely just the same code I have. And so if you pull it up in my browser, we should, whoops, eventually get some sort of styling. It's not there yet, so really quickly debug this. So table, React Bootstrap, we have table right here. And just looking at their docs again, this is usually how we might figure out how we would solve this. Again, these are third-party components. So to have them style correctly, we'll probably want to look just up here. Ultimately, tablethead table. I'll get rid of our class name equals app for now. All right, we'll fix that one. We'll fix that one in a little bit for now. Theoretically, the API for things like this is usually relatively import and then use right out of the gate from the from their website and from their docs. Obviously, your mileage may vary a little bit, but ultimately, almost all of them have a simple API reference. Oh, there we go. I forgot to say /table. That would be it. And so then, and this one does not need to be a default export anymore. So if we import from React Bootstrap /table, right, the imports again are different. I got confused between the 2 libraries. Material UI, the core, you import things by name. React Bootstrap, you can just import, it would seem, just easily by name. I'll just make sure quickly that my syntax is on. Cool. And then I will save and give my page a quick refresh. There's still a slight issue. Again, we'll just get back to this one a little bit later. It'll work a little bit later as well when you get the code. For now, we're going to jump instead. I will actually instead add 2 other components which are a little easier to use. Again, tables can get pretty complicated. A lot of the time we just need simple UI elements, right? Text, maybe a div, buttons, inputs. Material UI gives us access to these as well. So here I'm just going to give us a button in a text field. Text field is really one of their representations of like the text input. Think an input element with type equal to text. And we can do this really simply. Once I've imported it, I can just render it by name here. And then I can render also a button. Again, it's worth noting these are all capital letters, right? React uses capital versus lowercase letters specifically as a way it can try to govern, like, is this built into HTML versus is this a different component that changes slightly where it looks for and tries to render things. So pretty much all of these importables will have capital letters just like your own components do. Let's be quick button text saying click me. And if we look at it, we get over here, we'll add the quick class name equals app just so we can center things. And we get here, we get an input, which is very minimalist, but is like a nice user experience, and a button. It hovers when, it gets a different color when I hover over it. If I want, at least according to their docs, I can change the color from primary to something else. So we can say, let's try secondary. And usually, again, there are many built-in props that will help you style things like a little bit. All right, there we go. So there's our text color changed, our highlight color changed. Given enough time, we could customize, for example, the background or other little bits of functionality. But again, this even has like click-based feedback that we wouldn't, not that we couldn't make on our own, but that would take a lot of effort to make on our own. So at this point, we're going to quickly comment our table out just so we can not have to look at it visually. So we have a little more page to work with, and we're going to move on to one last concept, which is going to be this idea of what's called composition. You've sort of seen some of that already, right? We've seen components that can, a higher order component that can essentially take in data and then render other components. Composition is essentially, it's a React feature. It's used sort of as an alternative almost to inheritance. So we try to use composition and let components basically take in and alter the functionality, or sort of modularize our components so that they can render additional components as their children, instead of trying to create a bunch of like a complicated class inheritance model where we have a million components inheriting from each other. We instead usually like components that can take others as an input, render them in some specialized way. So an example of this, and I'll do this out here first just so we can see it, could be something really simple, like if we wanted to modularize some functionality to give different elements a specific background color. So if you want, we could actually just create a simple function called a background div that will take props as an argument, and it will return some child, right? But that child will have a background color of, arbitrarily just orange, right? We could pass this as a prop as well if we wanted. We're going to keep it to just something static for now. This will let us actually give any component as an input, and then in the return, we'll actually get some sort of output that includes whatever we can pass it, but also this background color. It's just a way you can add additional functionality to a component without having to rewrite it. So for example, here we can use, and this is a new concept we haven't seen, this prop called children, which is a weird concept, but the idea of props.children here is basically, all right, we pass a lot of props explicitly, right? Property equals value. props.children is actually going to be whatever appears between an open and a close element. So for example here, right, whatever this is might be children, or right, this would now be a child. It would be passed as props.children. It's a weird idea to see kind of what this means. Props.children basically means if I have an open background div and a closed background div elements, this will be anything between them. So let's take a look at this, right? Let's say, all right, let's create let's create a background div element right here. And then here give it, let me make sure I spelled it right. Yep. And then here give it a child that just says this is a p tag. All right. So this should hopefully, right, and you can see it's finding my function, which is good. In React, if you ever need to, in VS Code at least, if you mouse over and then hold on Mac Command, on Windows I believe it's Control, it should pop up a tooltip with the signature of the thing you're trying to render. It's a lifesaver for making sure your imports work. But in here we see we actually get this added functionality. Again, this isn't helping me, it's kind of ugly, but this is, you know, a quick basic idea, right? We can now take some component that provides functionality and then render children. All right. There's other ways we could do this that could be a little more complicated, right? So we're gonna, for example, we can make another component called columns. Then it might return with an N. It could return, you know, a div that has its display property set to flex. And then as its children, it might take, I'll just copy this for a second, so we don't have to write out 3 divs, right? We can, for example, take 3 child divs, each with a width of 33%. And essentially, this is a component that will make 3 columns. I can then pass it, instead of using props.children, I can pass it 3 props, left, center, and right, which could all be components. All right, so I could actually pass it, all right, props.left, right? This is going to be the actual output I want here. All right, and we could render it, for example, like, there may be a syntax error here, but it may not. So this is obviously, right, this isn't using children, this is using left, right, and center props specifically, so I'd have to create it like this. Columns left equals, and I will indent this so it's easier to see. Right, left equals, center equals, and then right equals. Then we'll close it on a new line. You know, we could say, here's a paragraph element. This is a p tag. Here we might have an h4. And then finally, on this side, we might have let's have another p tag. Whoops. Right. When I render my page, we see these actually show up correctly as 3 columns. But again, I've added this functionality into a component. I don't have to keep recreating columns, recreating, you know, complicated CSS. I can just always say, all right, I need a column. Take my columns component, pass it 3 children. All right, this could be, you know, this could be like 2 different forms, right? This could be an image and then 2 text fields, right? Whatever you need. You can modularize it really easy with this idea of composition. All right, so rather than, you know, using CSS, manually in a lot of places, or even keeping the same class name. We can also use composition to provide functionality from a parent to children. And this doesn't just stand true for CSS. This could be true for any type of functionality, right? If a component needs some certain kind of error handling, or needs a specific kind of data, right? We could always, for example, create a higher level component that takes like a URL, performs fetch, and then passes some sort of child the data, right? That takes, props of a component and a URL. And we could do something like that as well. Styling is just one of the places it's most useful, because styling is where you can find, code that's extremely rote, and you need to keep reusing the same styles, reusing the same sort of visuals over and over and over and over again, until you wish you had a better way to do it. So these are additional, again, examples just of ways we can use styling a little more efficiently in React. Yeah. So for styling, that's going to be mostly it. Again, these are just like brief introductions, and they don't replace CSS, right? All of the same. CSS we've learned already, still true. Some of the properties obviously change. They at least become camel cased, if not slightly more different. But again, we have the ability now to use what we know from JavaScript and built into React to our advantage, to at least minimize the styling we have to do, or make our lives easier and more efficient. Again, third-party libraries also exist to help us for that, but it's worth looking at quickly one other issue there, which is mostly that if you use a third-party library and you don't want to do much customization, the trade-off is going to be, Material UI components will look like this. Right, they will all look similar to the rest of the library. React Bootstrap components will usually look similar to this, right? The font colors, at least, you won't differentiate yourself as much, simply because that's the point, right? Out of the box solutions like that usually won't have the same kind of customization you could get elsewhere. All right. Otherwise, again, most of the components, like the table, for example, right, just need to get the working. I'll just need to go into their docs a little bit, figure out what the issue is, and just read. So there's, they're not 100% out of the box easy to use. There's a little research involved, but it can be easy, and especially for, big complex components, searches with autocomplete, tables that you can sort, popular functionality that would be more challenging to do with normal JavaScript, right? Calendars, things like that. Libraries can obviously be very useful to get that into your app and working much faster than doing it, obviously, from scratch.